Hello and welcome to the FatBoss Guide to start Augur Etraeus in the Nighthold.
So this encounter is a long one, and really the difficulty with this encounter lies in the last phase. Throughout the 3 phases, the boss has very similar abilities, but like the Spellblade Aluriel encounter that you lightly defeated before coming to this guy, the abilities slightly change per phase. To add, this encounter has a very tight damage requirement, and to make this requirement, you might want to consider bringing less healers than you usually would. There isn't all that much to heal until the last phase anyway. But let's kick it off and let's talk about phase 1.
Okay, to start off, you want to have your entire raid stacked behind the boss, and you want your tanks to be split on either side of the boss. His first phase will really begin at 95%, and this is a frost phase. Tanks, you will have to deal with ice bursts. The boss doesn't really melee hit you throughout the entire fight, instead it will just spam casts onto you. These casts in this phase will deal splash damage to anyone within 6 yards of you, and this is why you want to be split on either side of the boss, away from each other and the raid. Tanks will also be hit by gravitational pull. This is a debuff with 3 stacks, and after 10 seconds, a stack is removed. Each removal will cause a comet to land on you. This comet will do a large amount of damage to yourself and anyone within the targeting circle, but it also applies a very hard-hitting dot. The only way to remove this dot is by having at least 3 players move within 5 yards of you. They'll take a high burst of damage split between all players hit, and then the dot will be removed. The soaking players receive another debuff that makes it so the next time they soak within 12 seconds, they'll be stunned for a whole 10 seconds. So you need to rotate what players soak, only if you decide to drop the stack every 10 seconds. But instead of removing the dot after every comet application, we found it simply way easier to let all 3 comets hit our tanks and then have the dot stack up to 3. At that point, that debuff tank can move into the raid. Of course, during this time, while the tank is taking a shit ton of ticking damage because he has 3 really hard hitting dots on him, the other tank must be tanking the boss because the ice burst damage on top of the gravitational pull dot damage is going to really hurt your tank. And even when you're not tanking the boss, when you have like 2 or 3 stacks, you want to make sure you use your cooldowns carefully and you're making use of externals. Paladin tanks are particularly good for this. Spell Warding will make you immune to the application of the dot, as well as the dot damage, and Bubble will do a similar job. Unfortunately, Holy Shield doesn't work on anything in the entire fight, so don't even bother trying it. Other tanks will need heavy spot healing and good cooldown usage when the 2nd and 3rd tick has been applied, way more than what you'd expect on a Paladin tank. However, do not overuse CDs when you have this debuff, because you must have a CD ready for when the boss casts Frigid Nova. This ability does a huge amount of frost damage to everyone in the entire raid, however you can reduce this damage by having people within 5 yards of you. This is why the raid is stacked, it makes the ability deal virtually no damage whatsoever. However, as the tank with gravitational pull, you can't always stack, otherwise you risk landing meteors and dots onto the raid. Instead, you kind of just need to stand up by yourself and use cooldowns. The last thing you need to deal with in this phase is icy ejections. This debuff is applied to more and more players in your raid as the phase goes on, and it's just a 10-second dot that slows you more and more over its duration. When it expires, you will do a burst of splash damage to anyone nearby, so make sure you move immediately out of the raid when the debuffs come out, and healers make sure you spot heal those targets before the debuff expires. And you'll just keep repeating this over and over again until at 60% the boss will transition into phase 2, which is his Fel Phase.
So icy ejection have now become Fel. These debuffs on random players just deal low ticking damage, but they'll also cause puddles of Fel to spawn under your feet. Standing in these puddles applies a very nasty stacking dot. Just 2 stacks of this debuff will be very problematic for your healers, so you must avoid standing in them. Players with a debuff just want to move towards the edges of the room and just move every single time a puddle spawns, but try and keep the puddles as clumped as you possibly can. Keeping these puddles clumped up helps keep the room clear, but also makes the tanks way more effective when they have the gravitational pull. In this phase, Fel comets will land on you every 5 seconds instead of every 10 seconds, and you'll also have 5 stacks rather than 3. These meteors, when they land on you, deal large physical damage to yourself and also anyone else within the targeting circle, but importantly, they'll remove any puddles that are in that targeting circle. So to make the most of this debuff, you want to be stood near puddles just before the meteor lands so it clears as much room as you can. Just make sure that you're not stood on top of players. You want to clear fires, not clear them. As a tank, you'll also have to deal with Fel Burst. The boss's cast now just simply apply a stacking dot. This dot doesn't really do too much damage, and typically it'll drop when you taunt off each other for the gravitational pull. Just make sure that your stack never goes too high, you'll probably end up dropping it around the 6 to 7 mark. And lastly, the thing for everyone to watch out for in this phase is Fel Nova. At the end of this cast, everyone will take a burst of damage, but this damage is reduced the further away you are from the boss. Anyone still stood in melee range when this cast is finished will almost certainly be one-shot. So as soon as the cast starts, you want to use movement speed increases and get to the edges of the room as fast as you possibly can. And that's all you need to know for this phase until you eventually get the boss to 30% health, and then he'll transition into his final phase, which is his Void Phase.
Now during this Void Phase, tanks you will now be hit by Void Burst. This is very similar to Fel Burst, it's just a stacking dot. However, when it expires, it will jump to 2 other targets within the raid for half of its stacks. This acts as a pseudo enrage because towards the end of the fight, everyone is going to have so many stacks, and if the fight does last too long, you just won't be able to out-heal it. Extra Void Burst stacks are also applied when the boss casts Void Nova. In this phase, the Nova cast just deals a moderate amount of shadow damage to the entire raid and just applies 1 stack to everyone. And even more Void Burst stacks are also applied to the raid with the Ejection. The Ejection debuffs still deal ticking damage, however when they expire, that player will spawn a Voidling underneath them. These adds do nothing but apply Void Burst stacks with their melee hits. You just want to nuke these adds down just to keep stacks to a minimum. So yes, there's a lot of dots going out, so blanket healers in this phase are very, very strong. Now there is one last add that you'll need to deal with. When tanks receive the gravitational pull debuff in this phase, it will spawn a single comet when it expires, and it doesn't have any additional stacks. The comet deals virtually no damage, but it does however spawn an add with an absolutely insane amount of health. The add also has an aura which reduces the damage the add and the boss take by 99%, so you need to make sure that the gravitational pull debuff times out at the very edge of the room. While tanking the add on the outside of the room, you'll need your entire raid to swap to it and blow it up as soon as possible, because the add will cast Witness of the Void. This cast deals an unavoidable burst of damage to the entire raid, and its damage increases in power each time he casts it. The first and the second deal moderately high damage, but the third cast from this add is getting very close to one-shot territory. So for the first add, we recommend that you Bloodlust and nuke him down with cooldowns, and this just allows him to only cast this Witness of the Void twice. For all remaining adds that spawn, which should really only be 2 more, we use healing cooldowns on the second and third casts of Witness of the Void, as at this point, this is also where the raid has very high Void Burst stacks. For each cast, it's also important that you turn away from the add. Facing directly towards him after his cast is finished will fear you for 8 seconds. So in this phase, we stack behind the boss and nuke any voidlings that spawn. The moment the gravitational pull is applied to the tank, they move to the sides and all DPS swap to the add. We Bloodlust the first, kill off the second, however with the third add, we simply ignore him and nuke the boss. The reason behind this is that you're very nearly approaching the hard enrage of this encounter when the third add spawns. After so long, the boss will just cast the Big Bang, and this just instantly wipes your entire raid, so you need to kill him before this point.
And that's all there is to it in this phase, really. It's very simple. It's just, can you heal the crazy amount of damage that's coming in with Void Burst stacks, as well as the cast going off on the second and third add that comes in. Providing you can, and you have the damage, not too difficult of a boss, really. But thank you very much for watching, guys. If this guide helped you out, then do drop us down a like. It helps us out so much. And make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell to see when our videos are coming out next. And before we do go, we'd like to give a big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You guys are fantastic. And we shall see you all in the next video.
Thanks for watching.